Guys are really making progress on this build. Let's talk about the accessory drive, then we're going to look at the wiring. Alternator is pretty straightforward. This is our new style alternator bracket. You can see where the idler is. Install this main bracket loosely with this bushing and this bushing in the back. Put your alternator spreader bushing in between the lugs of the alternator. This rear bushing is critical to get on correctly. You'll notice there's a step at the front. That step fits into a tang at the back of the alternator casting. If you put it in backwards, there's going to be an interference there. You will notice that the front of the alternator is spaced back about 1/8 of an inch. There's a spacer actually built into this front bracket. So assemble everything loosely. When all the bolts are on, tighten that up. So that's pretty simple. Now on this lower bolt we do have a bracket that comes down and supports the front of the air compressor. So let's talk about the air compressor next. Now this is the hardest accessory to line up, and you want to do it in a multi-step process. You will get instructions, written instructions on how to do this, but I'll try to walk you through it quickly. First thing you want to do is install the AC main bracket. Use a square. Bolt the AC main bracket on with the 3 rear bolts, or as shown before, you may only have 2 if you have an iron block, and make sure that these ears are square with the head or the block. If they're not, you can slightly tweak them until they're perfectly perpendicular. Get those 3 rear bolts tight. Then you want to hang the alternator off this bracket with these 2 8mm bolts that we provide. Now kind of snug them up, but the alternator bracket has some slots, so this alternator can move back and forth and rotate. So we've now taken care of, let me get my straight edge here, by keeping these perpendicular with the block, we've taken care of this axis. Now we need to make sure that the alternator is square in this axis with the balancer and also this axis. So what you're going to do is you're going to use a straight edge or a laser finder, whichever you have, run it across the front of the balancer, sight it from the top, and make sure those grooves line up perfectly. If you have to rotate this, there's some play, there's some slots in these mounting holes. You can rotate the alternator in this plane, and in this plane you have to bend the ears in order to get it parallel with the balancer. But the goal is to get it completely parallel with the balancer and front to rear so the grooves line up. And it does take some diligence. Done properly, it's good for life. Not done properly, you're going to have issues. Now that being said, we do have a new billet AC bracket coming out in probably around this summer, the summer of 15. But this bracket setup works just fine if you do your diligence. Then you're going to run this spreader bar, or this spreader bracket, between the lower alternator bracket mounting point and the provided mounting point on this main AC bracket. Now, once this compressor is lined up this way, and this way, all 3 axes, tighten these 2 8mm bolts down, and the compressor will then be fixed. Then we need to move on to our rear bracket, which mounts here, and there's a second mounting point on the block. Now, do not install, and I'm sorry if you can't see this, do not install this lower bolt tightly. What you want to do is you want to install this rear bracket, and there may be a gap between the compressor housing and this rear bracket. If there is, run a shim in there. The goal is when you tighten this down, this rear bracket down, you do not want this compressor to move at all, because we know that it's lined up. So install the rear bracket, tighten it down on the block here and the lower 8mm bolt, then sight the gap. If there's a gap, shim it. So when you tighten this nut down, there's no movement, and your compressor is installed. Now let's talk about the power steering pump. Power steering pump's pretty simple. This is our newer power steering pump design with automatic belt tensioner. You will notice that this belt tensioner is slightly off to the passenger side, which is where we want it. You want it about straight up and down or slightly off to the passenger side. That gives you really good tension. And this is a 1055 length belt, 6 groove. If you're running a PSC pump with a smaller pulley, you're going to want to run a 1045 belt. So 6K 1045 or 6K 1055, depending on the power steering pump you're running. This idler is going to be pre-installed on the front bracket. There's a spacer that's already provided for you on the front of this power steering bracket. You're going to loosely assemble this, and let me describe the procedure that I recommend. Loosely install this front bracket with the 2 bushings provided in the water pump. Lightly tighten these down. Have your tensioner on. Now when the tensioner is on without a belt, it's going to be right up against the water pump, and that's where it should be. So loosely assemble that. Then bolt your your power steering pump on with the 3 bolts, just like stock. Do not do anything with this rear bracket at this point. Just assemble this front assembly exactly the way you see it here. Then get yourself a longer straight edge, and if you don't have a laser alignment tool, and you're going to run it across the balancer and make sure that this power steering pump is perfectly in line with the balancer. If it needs to be shimmed forward or backwards, you're going to take that up with these bushings. You can use a shim behind one of these bushings, but you shouldn't have to. These are pretty accurate, and it should get you where you want to be. So what I suggest you do is when the power steering pump, front bracket, and pump are on and mounted, install the belt. Turn the crankshaft over 6 or 7 times and look at the tracking of the belt. The belt needs to track right in the center of the idlers. Excuse me. You want to see it running comfortably on all the groove pulleys. You might see, if you see it wanting to pull towards the front or pull towards the back, then something is not aligned properly. You need to identify that and fix it. Done properly, this drive is good for 7,000 RPM. Now we do have a new drive, a new updated drive coming out later this summer that's going to use more billet brackets, but this drive works just fine if you set it up properly. Notice the clearance on the belt to the outlet. You've got plenty of clearance between the water pump pulley and the upper belt. This steam port will come down. These are very flexible and will then run right alongside the upper radiator hose, and that'll come out up to the radiator. So once you get the power steering pump where you want it, tighten everything down, turn the crank over multiple times, make sure that it's running in line. All the pulleys are running the way they should. A good indicator would be this top belt and this water pump belt. They should be right in line with each other. If you notice that this is shifted back or forward, then something is amiss. You might have the air compressor off. Everything is indexed off this balancer. This balancer is your one fixed point that can't be moved. So all the other accessories need to be aligned to this balancer. So use a straight edge before you put the tensioner on. Use a straight edge to each one of these accessories and make sure that they're perfectly aligned. Once you get the power steering pump installed and the front bracket tight, then we know that's where it's going to stay. We're going to install this rear bracket. We've actually run these without the rear brackets, but I like to have it. Now, here in-house, we drill a clearance hole for a 10 millimeter right through the water pump lugs and run a nut and a bolt. It's easier. If it's already in the vehicle, all you have to do is run a short, like 25 millimeter, 10 millimeter by 1.5 pitch bolt from the back side into these two positions and tighten this rear bracket down onto the water pump. Then we have provided you with spacers. Now this is an 1/8 inch bracket, so it is somewhat flexible, but get these spacers as close as you can to the length. This position here is not machined, so there's a little bit of tolerance. The front position is machined, so that's going to be the same every time. This rear position is cast. We use GM pumps, and they're very accurate, so you'll see that the bushings come out right almost every time. But if you're using an aftermarket pump like a from AutoZone, whatever, it may be in a slightly different position, so you might have to shim these bushings out a little. But again, this is a 3/16 bracket, this is an 1/8 inch bracket, and these will move a little bit. So when that's all said and done, tighten your 3 rear bolts down and the 2 mounting bolts down in the rear, and it boxes it all in and makes it really strong. You should have no issues with it from that point on. Here's a little picture of our transmission cooler tubes with a provided bracket that comes in the kit. And let's walk around. Now this has already been installed. This is our crankshaft position sensor, and for the current time we are running these and they work just fine, but you have to be very careful how you set these up. You'll see that you've mounted our crankshaft position sensor holder onto the tab that's provided on the air conditioning bracket, and this holder is adjustable and has a lot of movement. You want to adjust it so that, and I'm trying to get a good picture here for you, so that the nose of this crankshaft position sensor is centered right over the center of the ring. So if you looked at it from this position, you would see that it's right over the center of the ring. You want about a 25 thousandths gap between the crankshaft position sensor and the tone ring, and you want to make sure that this tone ring is perpendicular to the trigger wheel. So if you were to draw a line straight through this crankshaft position sensor, it would go straight through the center of the harmonic balancer bolt. If you need to tweak it a little bit up or down, this 1/8 inch bracket is not hard to bend. Get this perfect now. If you get this perfect now, you will never have any issues. Now, again, that being said, our new generation, our 3rd generation kit is going to be sensorless on this crankshaft position sensor, but for now this works fine. You need to set this up properly and you will never have an issue with it. I suggest you use a new sensor from GM, I'm sorry, from Chrysler. They cost about $15 or $20 and they're very sensitive, so if you were to drop this sensor, the odds are it's bad and you should replace it. So get this aligned according to the instructions that you got with your kit, and you shouldn't have any issues with your tach signal. Now, looking back at the cam sensor, I think we talked about this. You'll notice this is a much cleaner setup. Essentially, we've taken the 5-pin connector that GM supplies that normally goes down here, and we've cut the 3 wires out that we need, and we have then tapped them directly into the camshaft sensor, and that makes a nice clean setup. So we're going to talk about the wiring in the next video.